Yeah, thanks again for inviting me along this year. I think, as I said, I've been here since about 2005, which is actually, when you put that into context, was 11 years. But I think one of the key things that we've been doing is, in that time, we've really started to focus a lot on, we really now only focus on higher education. So from that, what we've actually been doing is trying to learn from a lot of the work that we do around the world, you know, what's actually working and what's not working with a lot of the other different universities in relation to their conversion techniques. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I mean, we work across the whole sector now. We work in about 200 universities. Nothing I'm saying here is a commercial pitch, obviously, for what we do. But what we are doing is we're working with so many universities now. Some of them are, like many of you here, are just having struggles trying to manage all of the sprawling number of websites across their campus. Others, though, are starting to push boundaries once they get that in place and actually do things like increase conversion rates, recruitment. In the US, alumni fundraising is a massive activity. So really, from this presentation here, what I'm trying to do is, last year I talked about sort of personalisation and content targeting techniques that are available to people to try and use. And I suppose a year has gone by and we actually now have a bit of data as to, well, what techniques are actually starting to work and what ones aren't really working. So I'm going to focus on three techniques that I suppose we have data on to show what actually is working. And then I've got two techniques for, I suppose, the future that we'd be interested in sort of getting some feedback from yourselves as you start to use them. Two little plugs before we jump into the presentation is we have what I think is the best blog in the world. No, we just focus on higher ed digital marketing. A key point, though, is if you're doing good stuff, please let us know, and we're always interested in showing off lots of people's work around the world. So even, you don't have to be a client or anything, you can just let us know. We're always happy to profile it. And what can be great is that you can then show it to your boss and go, oh my God, we're being covered in an international blog, and then they get the bronze statue for you and you're all famous on campus. The second one is just our web survey. So a lot of the stuff we do, we get out of we do an annual survey. It's our 4th year running. There's vouchers and stuff, prizes. You'll be in the draw if you do the survey. It's very short, but it's really trying to get an insight into web teams and the challenges that you have. Anyway, that's my little plug. So really today, what I'm going to do is really look at some techniques that are used, have originated in e-commerce, but then trying to apply them to higher ed. And I think one of the challenges can be is that selling books online or selling widgets is not the same as engaging with potential students and other audiences in a higher education environment. And I suppose it's trying to see what actually works really well. So I suppose, as I said, we've built up really good data now. What I'll say is the data and the percentage improvements that I'm showing, I don't have. If there's statisticians here in the audience, you'll be throwing books and empty bottles at me. We don't have a huge range of massive amount of data to have sort of statistically significant results. But I hope, at least from today, it will give you an indication of what other universities are achieving using some of these techniques. I'll talk a tiny bit about the prerequisites and then the 5 different techniques. I suppose really, this whole area is called conversion rate optimization. And for many of you here in the room, and we see this across many universities, often student recruitment and student marketing can be completely separate to the web team. And I'm sure many of you are in universities where that's the case. In other places, it's a lot more joined up. Pros and cons, I think, of both approaches. But I think what's key about this is that using this sort of data and measuring the success of how your website's performing from a conversion and recruitment point of view, even if you're not working in recruitment, it's a really good, I suppose, way of communicating the value you're providing and actually making budget cases. So what we have actually seen is that if you can track the improvements you're making and even put a monetary value on those, you can then make a much stronger budget case for your wider projects. And this is something that I've been saying for about 2 years, and we've seen some really good examples of it. The University of British Columbia in Canada, they actually worked with the finance team I mentioned last year, and they got a value for every new student that that is accepted, and then they worked it backwards up the funnel to say every lead is worth this amount. So I would say that's really important. The other thing is if you're benefiting another team's goals, and you're helping them, say they have student recruitment goals, there might be opportunities to get them to contribute. I'll say might, depends how nice they are, to get them to contribute towards your projects. So you could say, well, hang on, if we spend this amount, we think we can increase conversion by this amount, and that's going to help your goals, and so on. And then I suppose really it's important that when you're communicating, you working towards these goals, this sort of language really works well as it goes through the upper layers of your organization. If it's all linked into your strategic plan. So it's not like, well, we need a budget to do this project. It's, well, we're actually going to fulfill these goals that are part of the strategic plan and contribute towards those, and that's why it's important. So really what I would say is, the final one is really, it then also helps you determine what's worth spending time on. But a lot of this, it does presume that you've got your general web structure in a good place. You've got good content strategy, you've got good team, and so on. Like, you don't want to be jumping into this stuff if you're still having trouble with sort of content quality and basic things. So what I would really say is, when you're designing your goals, really know your organizational goals, the numerical goals, that is, because sometimes when you pick up the strategic plans in university, they all look a little bit similar. So actually get down to the numbers and see, well, how can I help those numbers? Because you have a much better chance in raising budget if you can link it into those. Then have team goals that link into your organizational goals, and then also get to know the recruitment funnel. If you're not familiar with that, if recruitment is done elsewhere, by getting to know your recruitment funnel, then you can see exactly where you can contribute in it. Is there anyone here who hasn't heard or isn't familiar with the recruitment funnel? Okay. So it's really only just one person, but it's basically your funnel. Like, you have your number of leads, then it goes down to qualified leads, and then you have people who are really very interested, and maybe then for say postgraduate people who apply, and then people who are accepted. So the funnel goes down that way. What your aim is to try and improve conversion from each level. So then ultimately, it's not just about having more at the top, but if you can convert more along the way, you have a higher number of applicants right at the end. And I think that's absolutely key. So what I'm going to do is, really, I suppose, a lot of this, of what I'm going to talk about, there's some prerequisites. You need to have effective tracking in place. And this isn't just Google Analytics. You need to have your goals set up. You need to have proper, as well, attribution to know exactly where people are coming from. And this is the tricky one. This is the channels that they contacted us in the early days, and then they were accepted right at the end. And that can be very tricky to get that whole attribution the whole way through, because obviously you don't get the full flow. It's not like that journey happens on your website the whole time. And it's also a challenge for online shops as well, or even physical shops. You might have done research online, and then you walk into your Currys or your Dixons and buy the actual thing. And really the conversion funnel. And what I would say is that you need to be familiar not just with, there will be many types of funnel in your organization. How you're targeting, say, postgraduate students will be quite different to sort of obviously how you target undergraduate. And almost having a dashboard where you can see this data and measuring this is so key. So what I'm going to do is look at a couple of different ideas of things that are happening. Some of this you might be doing. If you are, I'm really interested in knowing as well. I'm particularly at the end, if any of you would like to talk about some of the stuff you're doing. But I'm really interested in. I've got some percentages we've experienced with some projects in terms of improvements. What I would definitely say is, we'd love to know what improvements you guys have had and what techniques, because it sort of helps us help our clients focus on the stuff that's going to get the best return. One of the examples I'm going to really talk about today is it's part of the University of Massachusetts in the US, in an area called Dartmouth, right down the south of Massachusetts. If you're sort of going towards Martha's Vineyards, that sort of, it's a sort of a dodge. No, there's a live stream actually. Sorry. So it's a lovely, beautiful area right at the bottom of Massachusetts. Really great, lovely place. But this is the law school I'm going to talk about. So, they didn't come from a great place when it came from online marketing. And obviously, they have a good web team and good ideas. So we used this as a good example. And also I want to try and pick an example that might be less familiar to you, so you could at least, it's not a story you've heard before. But the ultimate result was, through a number of about 8 different things, we got the conversion rate. So that's the number of inquiries up by 300%. Literally within a tiny amount of time. And they did a talk at our user conference over in Boston, and it's just fascinating stuff, and it was all fairly straightforward. So I'm going to use some examples from this particular one, but from this it's just been fantastic, because with these results, everybody in the law school is really chuffed with the results. It's now starting to ripple across the university, and it's raised the credibility of the team in delivering not just really good web projects, but actually really good results overall. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, we use some techniques here in terms of personalisation and content targeting. So I presented on this last year, and I talked about things like there's lots and lots of different techniques that you can use, from geographic targeting to actually some subtle little things. I'll talk about some of those here. So one of these, I tried to come up with a little key of little coloured arrows, but I'm not sure it's going to work, so I'll just explain it to you in plain English. So these are the sort of general types of personalisation techniques that people are using. So geographic makes sense. Obviously someone coming from a different place. Behavioural and course search. This one is primarily using the course. Behavioural personalisation generally is looking at certain activities that people are doing on the website. For example, if somebody's looking for scholarships, or for, you could sort of say, actually, in the US, there's a financial calculator that every university has to have to properly estimate the cost of going to the university. So what you're doing is you're using activities on the website to personalize the content. Clickstream is just like what they're clicking on. Email marketing is where you embed some links in your email marketing that they could only have got that link by getting a certain type of email from you, maybe an alumni email, something like that. People visiting from other organisations, and then also retargeting, which you may be familiar with, those ads that follow you around and stuff like that. So what I would say is, I've put little orange arrows for things. What we're finding here is that the geographic and the people visiting from other organisations can actually have a really good uplift, but not in all cases. What we're finding is, so I suppose originally people were like, oh, well, we're a university in Manchester. If somebody's coming from, Bristol or London, let's, I don't know, change the look a bit. I'll let you guys figure out how you change it to make someone from London feel more at home. But anyway, but the point is that we're not finding that actually having a huge impact. Where we are, obviously, is the obvious one, is foreign student recruitment. You want a different story, like medical schools, where you have people coming from, say, places like the Philippines, the Middle East, and America. They have very different needs and they have very different requirements. The other one that we're actually finding out surprisingly good, having really good impact, is people from other organisations. And this is primarily in cases where you do continuing professional development programs. So one of the examples here was part of the University of Dartmouth Law School. At certain times in the year, they do continuing professional development short courses. What they do is they put in some personalisation that spots from the name of the organisation that they're coming from whether they're potentially a law firm. So it looks for, they firstly have a list of all the law firms in Massachusetts, and then they look for certain patterns. So you have, I think it's LLC, I think is sometimes a limited like partnership type thing. So they look for certain phrases in people visiting their site. So they're not, if someone's coming from a law firm, they're not going to talk about that much about undergraduates. They're going to talk about some of these continuing professional development programs. And that can be really helpful. Another one is, from a particular school. If you want to target a particular local school. Another one example is for recruitment or people transferring. If you can see that they're coming in, one of the variables you can see is the organisation who owns the IP address that they're coming from. Now, of course, it could come up as, Virgin Media or whatever if you're at home, but it could come up as a university. So you might have a different piece about like transferring or maybe job opportunities if you're coming from another university. The one that's having a really big improvement, though, is using course search as your means to actually drive some very basic personalisation. And we were chatting, I think, on the first day about sort of like how do you even start thinking through some of the personalisation. You can sort of get stuck in. You can start thinking about it too much and not actually doing it. I would say the first thing to try and do is link it into course search, because that's where they're telling you exactly what they're interested in. They're telling you exactly whether it's undergraduate, postgraduate, and then what course topic area that they're interested in. And just use that in a subtle way to increase conversion. So the e-commerce average of using personalization on a website is about a 19 to 20% improvement in conversion. We're seeing it much higher in higher ed, but particularly in this example is using course search. We're seeing it like 30 to 40%, because and it's typically the problem is when people come back to your website, and particularly if you're a university that has a really wide range of programs and degrees, it's always the medical school or always the business school that seems to sometimes take over the stories. But this way you can say, well, actually, I know they're interested in textiles or art and design. I'm actually going to introduce photography that's a bit more relevant and help they feel more connected to. And then it's things like, for example, I know they're interested in engineering. So I'm going to say, we're organising an engineering open day on this day. Would you like to come along? As opposed to sign up for our general open day. We're having slightly extra levels of conversion there. We are seeing, though, some people getting really high. Like, we've had some examples of much higher levels of conversion, but that's often where like finding courses can be just a complete disaster anyway. So probably they're benefiting from having a good course search solution and then the personalisation. So I would say it all comes down to this type of box. And literally, it's like looking, I always describe it as being, it's like looking over someone's shoulder and them telling you what they're interested in. And then you can just, it's like any conversation, you listen and then you feed it back, and they feel more engaged. The next one then I would say is call to action optimization. So this is like the buttons, or whatever you want to call them, where people are actually clicking on to try and actually increase conversion. So you want an inquiry, have a prospectus delivered to you or something like that. I would say some universities say, for example, like just having the PDFs is downloadable. I would say try and collect even a little bit of information, like their email address or first name, last name email address, just so you have some sort of data to show maybe who they are, because then you can always fill in their profile a little bit later on. So there's some great books on this topic, on A/B testing on Amazon. I think it's Let's Test That is a good example, sort of like has a red or orange and green cover. I can tweet it afterwards. A really good book I'd recommend on it. So what we're finding is in higher ed, what's having the most impact is colour placement and reducing friction. And I'll talk about friction in a moment. The wording, less so, because maybe that's just a thing in higher ed that like it's pretty obvious. It's not like in e-commerce you're trying to really strong arm someone into making a purchase. Like, they're probably coming there with a purpose of wanting to get extra information anyway. And I think there's two parts to this. In the case of the UMass law, they really upfront, they actually had very strong, and I zoomed in a little bit here, but it's basically, you can see there the call outs are really strong. Like, they're there when you get into the homepage. It's like, I want to apply, organise a visit or request information. I think sometimes these just get hidden a little bit, but sometimes it actually improves the user journey if they're available right up there and makes it in one click that they can sort of, at least tell you what they're interested in, and then you can then use that information. So in UMass, so basically when you read those books on Amazon, right, which I would recommend reading, but basically some of the conclusions are there's some very particular colours, as you can guess what they might be on this particular slide, as to what buttons colours really work. And it's sort of a light blue, an orange and a green. I think where in universities it tends to not work out so well is that everybody tries to get everything to be on brand. And I think the problem is then your call-out buttons tend to be in line with your branding, which means that they tend to actually get lost. So there's a number of, say, universities where like they have a blue colour logo and all the call-out buttons are blue, are dark blue. what you'll find is by changing those colours, you'll get much better conversion rates because they stand out. And that's in the UMass Law project. We literally went with best practice. Like the guy who wrote the Let's Test That book, he said he was involved in I think it was the Obama A/B testing stuff around the initial campaigns, and he said, look, we know scientifically these colours connect quicker with people and they're likely to press it. This is an area where you can actually get, like in e-commerce, it's 21 to 40% improvement. But I think it was SAP, the software company, I think by changing their call-out buttons on one particular campaign, they got an improvement, I think it was like 40 to 50% by changing their call-out buttons to orange, so they would stand out more. What we're finding, though, is that it actually seems to be lower in higher ed. It does seem to be better, but I think, though, maybe the rationale, and be interested in people's views, is maybe people are coming there and see it as a friendly channel to engage with, where like if that as soon as like you fill out some forms online, like a sales, not from TerminalFOUR ever, we'd never do that, but someone will call you like straight away, and it's almost like then, and they'll follow you around and stuff like that. So I think maybe, I don't know, maybe it is just that they feel that it's an easier, they don't feel threatened as much, so they're happier to sort of find the button. What we do find as a problem is that people aren't placing their call-out buttons in the right place. I would definitely say that sort of location is quite good, but I would also say on longer course pages, do have them at the bottom as well. So as people scroll down, there's places along the way. But often we see that those call-out buttons are right at the bottom. And that's just, you're wasting an opportunity for them to talk to you there.
So, do you have any influence stickiness? If you have the buttons travelling with the...
No, I don't actually. No, I don't think I've seen that much. Are you guys doing that? Yeah, I'd be really interested to know if you have any data on that. But I'd be interested on that as well. I think some of it, though, can be multi-device stuff as well. It's how does it work, and the call-outs work when you're on a phone. Do they end up getting sort of like really shoved down the bottom as well? So I don't, but I'd be interested in. Yeah, I'd be really curious. We can maybe compare against somebody else. We are seeing them people who, now this is typically where people are in a really bad place, like have had like really crappy call outs hidden away, that's where they can get improvements. The third one, and this will be the last of the ones where we have good data on, has to be around form optimization. This is the standard type of form that comes from like tribal SITs. And I think this is a challenge not just of Tribal, or it's every CRM solution that's out there, whether it's Hobson's, Microsoft Dynamics. What ends up happening is that the standard forms that they develop, and you've probably all seen it, they expect like pretty much a life story. What was your first pet? What was your favourite rock band when you were 17? Well, I suppose they would be 17. So, and it's just ridiculous. So what ends up happening, though, is that it's sort of like when you guys talk to the people who are typically running a CRM project, they go, oh, that's just a standard form. But there are ways to actually really narrow down the form fields. And this is potentially using those CRM's APIs. So Sunderland have done some really good work on top of Hobson's CRM, where they actually are just collecting the data in increments instead of the whole big form. And that's something that has a big benefit. So if there's a direct correlation between reducing the number of fields and the completion rate of your form. So you could reduce it down, and what you can always do is follow up and collect other data later on. Just collect the basics, and then really narrow it down. Say, well, what are the essential things that you need, and really narrow it down to like just a tiny form that's so easy to complete. So there's a couple of different things that you can do here. One is number of fields has a massive impact. I mean, we all know it from trying to fill out car insurance quotes and all this sort of stuff. Just the less information, the better. The second one is asking for information they don't have to hand. There was a small college in Ireland. I was looking at one of their forms. Nobody here, so everyone's off the hook. But they were looking for the person's, to apply, they were looking for the person's social security number, just to inquire. It's like, you don't need that until like they've actually been accepted, you know. And I know the person who worked in that college, and there was a whole argument internally as to why this was necessary or not. So avoid those. I would also say this is one, like multi-device testing is key. Making sure your forms work on different devices, different screen sizes, and they're easy to fill in. There are tools like Formissimo, some of you might have heard of, are easy to plug in. It's a bit of JavaScript, you put it on your form pages and it will tell you, hang on a second, people with Android are not completing your form as much as people on other. And that can be a good example of maybe some validation rule or something is going weird on that form. Simplifying validation rules. There's also a correlation of around improvements in, I would say, in-field validation as opposed to server validation. If you could tell the person as they're filling it in that maybe their email address isn't valid, rather than them submitting it and it going off and stuff, there's those are improvements. And there's also now quite a few people talking about improvements, and now we haven't collected data on this, but there's certainly, if you Google it, we're seeing improvements when you have small lists of data. Instead of going with drop-down lists, go with radio buttons. I'm not sure why. Well, it's probably more visible, but I think for long lists of like degrees, that could be trickier. But anyway, it's something to consider. There's definitely some people, quite a few people talking online about that. So I'd say in e-commerce, I don't have data on the improvements, but there are a lot of good blogs around this. Formissimo, to be fair, do some good blogs on this whole topic around their product. But definitely in higher ed, I think the problem is the use cases in outside higher ed are a bit too varied to look at data. What I would also say in higher ed though, if you, like even the simple one of removing fields or having a simple way. So we have a form builder product in our new version of our product. What we're setting up for some people is that they collect maybe 5 bits of data that populates the mandatory fields in the CRM, and then we come back and collect the other data over time. But you know, if you, like we've had some people with terrible forms, you know, like the generic Hobson's forms, you can get massive improvements. So what I would definitely say is the challenge of these standard forms in like CRMs is just a massive challenge. And often there's pushback from the people who own those systems of, oh no, we can't change that. You know, we can't link into that. So, but actually often you can. It's often a bit of, it's not just a technical conversation, it's mostly sort of like people not wanting to bother, you know. Anyway, that's a shame, but. So the next two things I'm really going to quickly finish off on are two areas that we're starting to see some interest in. I don't have data, but maybe next year it's something I can loop back on. And the first one is using things like chat on the site. And the solutions like, well, obviously there's lots of solutions in this area. Obviously the big international one is Intercom, where actually a guy who used to work with us now is one of the founders of there. So he's doing very well for himself. But there's another one that's used quite a bit in higher ed is Pubble. But so we're actually seeing some improvements, particularly with foreign student recruitment, wanting to ask questions online, and they find it more comfortable chatting an online chat rather than like on a telephone or in person, maybe because it's like the translation function. So the things to consider around this are, you know, what time zones do you manage this, and how does that work in terms of your team? Do you only do it for certain target markets? Do you have it only running for certain maybe areas? What languages? Is it just English, or do you try and, because maybe you might have parents who might have questions? And then I think the challenge here though is tracking it, saying, I know somebody engaged with us using chat, and did that actually improve them applying in the end? I think that can be a bit of a tricky one, and sort of linking the data through to your CRM. So what I would say is, really interested if you're doing stuff on this and you have any data, please do share it with us. The fifth one, what I would say is predictive data analysis. This is a huge thing in the US, and this is but I haven't seen it outside the US. In the US, they typically, for even undergraduate level, they buy leads. They say, I'm going to spend like $1 million, which would be typical enough, and buy leads of students who are coming into the undergraduate cycle. But the same thing happens in postgraduate and so on. There's actually been really good success stories of where they can get data on the of what they would call successful students and the right fit for their university, they put it through a predictive analytics engine and look at the leads and the data that comes with those leads, and actually they're able to better pick the leads that are going to be have a higher conversion rate. We were talking about this last night in the bar, and it's such a fascinating area because here it's hard to imagine like this data all being used because of the really high levels of data protection, but they're actually saving a lot of money by spending $1 million on leads, but getting ones that are more likely to be successful. So we're trying to figure out sort of ways of using this sort of model in the UK. But it's something I'd like to I think it's worth looking at what they're doing in the US. I think there's a lot that can be got from it. And really the whole aim is that you end up recruiting people, but they end up staying the course, and they end up being successful themselves as well. I think there's definitely a lot of things that you can do with this, like comparing leads, or if you get a lot more leads in, which ones do you spend the time on really, to nurture and, give them a personal guided tour around on an open day, as opposed to, a minibus packed with like 100 people, and so on. So I think, there's also debate as well. They're saying, like, are the predictive analytics engines in picking the leads and you spending more time with certain students, is that sort of alienating people who maybe don't fit the model but actually would do very, very well? Anyway, I hope that gives you some ideas anyway of things you could play around with, and certainly if you've tried any of these things, you can. We'd also love to hear. But I think really my main point out of this today is not just some ideas and experiences that we've had. I think it's using this stuff. So going back to the first slide of using and becoming a data-orientated team, and being able to show the work that you're doing is having a monetary impact on the university. It's a very strong piece of making a budget case. Yes, there are things you can highlight in terms of risk, CMA, accessibility, reputation, but actually having numerical values around leads and stuff like that it's very convincing. And I think that's something that you can definitely take on board and take away from this presentation today. Thank you very much again, and thank you Brian and Claire and everybody for having me here today, and very happy to take any questions, or if anyone has even any comments about any of this sort of stuff, I'm very happy to answer any questions, if that's okay.